You're listening to Rashkin Report. This is Yuri Rashkin, and my guest today is professor of University of Concordia at Montreal, also a writer, Mikhail Iossel, returning guest of this show. Mikhail, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Yuri. Thank you. Glad to be back.
Absolutely. You write quite a bit about President Trump, and geez, he's in the news these days even more than usual on hourly basis as this crisis is exploding and looks like it might actually negatively affect him. How do you feel? Do you feel vindicated? Do you feel glad? How are you feeling now that it looks like President Trump is about to get impeached?
Um, Cautiously hopeful and nervous and apprehensive because we're in a very dangerous situation of someone completely uncontrollable, pathologically incapable of assessing the world outside of himself, someone who is now fighting for literal physical survival because he knows that if he doesn't get reelected, he is going to be put on trial and then end up in jail. And so we're in a situation of someone who has absolutely no moral bottom. There is no law he couldn't sink to, and for the sake of his survival, he basically is going to be prepared to do whatever it takes. He doesn't even know what it takes, but whatever it takes, he will not think twice to sacrifice any number of uh, American interests. He would not hesitate to involve America in some kind of a military adventure to whip up a wave of chauvinism among his electoral base. We're in an exceptionally dangerous situation of somebody who is not only is he unfit, he is unfit to be within 10 miles of the White House. He would be unfit to run a parking lot. It's a very dangerous situation. So and the more pressure is put on him, the greater the acceleration of his sundowning or his unraveling. So his presidency is unraveling. Presidency in quotation mark is unraveling, but he also is emotionally, psychologically unraveling also with dangerous acceleration, and it's we are in a totally uncharted territory right now, in the sense that nothing like this has ever happened before, not in any modern memory, not in any kind of memory, not even going back to Andrew Jackson. We just don't remember anything like this. We've never had a person so manifestly, demonstrably, absolutely, uniquely unfit to sit in the White House. And so it's a horrible situation.
Do you think that the fact that it looks like there is Secretary Pompeo and potentially Vice President Pence and so many people are part of this scandal and involving call to Ukraine and pressuring them to do us a favor, which people seem to get confused by because that's really just that's all that it's about. Once you ask for a favor to find dirt for your about your opponent, that's pretty much it. There's no quid pro quo anymore. At that point, you're done. But do you feel that having more people ensnared in this is going to make the end of this administration more likely or less likely?
Um, when and if, but when he goes down, the whole bunch of them will go down because it's a mob. And so everyone is somehow enmeshed and everyone is connected by the mutuality of the criminal activities. And so, and that's, of course, was absolutely conscientious decision on the conscious decision on Trump's part to basically taint as many people as possible with this situation, so not to have a plausible deniability, but to deprive them of any possibility of plausible deniability, and so the whole ship will go down. And again, because this is not just the regular, White House administration; it's a mob, and it's Don Vito Corleone, only like stupider, and and they will all go down, and so. That's why the situation is only going to become more dire and more dangerous for Trump and therefore for all of us, because he's going to be more and more desperate. More and more evidence will be coming to light. More and more hair-raising circumstances will be revealed, and mainly engaging the sheer scope of his efforts to get reelected, to establish different kinds of quid pro quo, his dependence on Putin. One just shudders at the thought of the when, if and when conversations with Putin, for instance, uh, get come to light. So that's why there is no light at the end of that tunnel for him, or for the Republicans in the Senate or in the House. It's not going to get better. They will know. There will be no sort of like uh, uh, any kind of mitigating circumstances. Nothing that would sort of like cause people to say, "Oh, okay, that explains it." No, it will only get worse and worse and worse, and people's mood is going to darken ever more so continually. And
I hate to say it, but is this where civil war would be more likely?
well, um, this is still not a banana republic, and we still don't have a tradition of having the army engaged in public life. And if we are prepared to imagine uh, military involvement in the streets of America, then all bets are off. But I don't think so.
But Trump doesn't want to leave.
Well, yeah, he won't want to live, and he will try to because he doesn't want to end up in jail, um, and for a variety of other reasons. It's just his whole personality is now undergoing complete unraveling. But he will issue. Let's say he will issue an order to. For the army to support him. I can't even imagine. And if there is a local mutiny of his supporters coming down the pike with their AK-47s and so forth, well, that's what the army is for. Um, we are pretty far into the territory of absolutely nightmarish scenarios, as you can imagine.
Right.
And yeah.
I'll remind listeners at this joyful moment that you're listening to a Rashkin Report. My name is Yuri Rashkin, and my guest is writer Mikhail Iossel, also professor of Concordia University in Montreal, Canada. And Mikhail is an author of you have a new book out, well, relatively new in the last year, Notes from Cyberground, Trumpland, and My Old Soviet Feeling. Can you share with the audience any thoughts on either, Russia is just such a big player in our affairs now, in that even though we're all are speaking English, but our background is from there somewhat. How do you, having that background, you view what's going on between Trump and Putin, or just Russia's involvement in our political system at this point?
Well, Putin basically is probably the most sinister political figure on the world stage, because his lifelong project, whether he articulates it to himself or not, is to prove to the people of Russia, first and foremost, but also to the rest of the world, that democracy doesn't work. And that by osmosis, that people are always animated and driven by rank self-interest, that there is no nobility to any kind of public service, that people are always in it for personal gain. Generally, that people are worse than they tend to think of themselves. And so, if there had been one glowing success of his 19, 20 years uh, at the helm of power in Russia, it has been uh, the the um, inculcation of absolutely monstrous amounts of cynicism into the Russian mind, or basically just injecting into the Russian bloodstream um, this elephantine dose of cynicism.
And that's
And
such an excellent point because I think cynicism is really critical to being able to engage with society and to just make decisions. Because when you talk about Putin and his trying to spread the idea that there's nothing good in public life, there's no reason in getting involved, everybody's just doing it for themselves, for the money, everyone's crooked. We see that mindset and point of view reflected frequently in conservatives right here.
yeah, that's why Trump likes Putin, because Putin basically is his kind of guy. And conservatives, yes, they um, they like they like strength in leaders, so that a priori they have a totalitarian bent.
But if we look at the opposite of cynicism, I guess it would be what, like being naive?
Well, uh, it's all a matter of dosage, and not necessarily naive, but people over the course of their lives are not stuck at one point, in one fixed point along the axis of being good or bad. People keep shifting, and sometimes they become worse than themselves, and sometimes they become better than themselves, depending on circumstances and depending on what they want to do with their lives. And people go through different ages of their lives. Becoming different people, knowingly or unknowingly, and people are not known quality, and known quantity, and so uh, that's why it's hard to predict how people will react sometimes, and how large masses of people would react sometimes, because they cannot predict it themselves very often. But generally, American presidents, as a matter of historic records, every single American president would call people to serve the better angels of their nature, or to dedicate themselves to the cause bigger than themselves, right? Including Republicans like John McCain, for instance, right? But everyone, just from almost every presidential speech or inauguration speech, would include those kind of, calling people to do something that is bigger than their own lives. Well, not so with Trump, and not so with Putin, and not so with the conservatives that sympathize with Putin. They basically call for the worst angels of human nature. So it's just a matter of general attitude towards life, and what you believe life should be all about, and uh, and uh, and that's a very murky and area, because again, people's character, individually or collectively, is fluid. Um, so that's why I would say. But there is there is certain fixedness to the character of people like Trump, who have been warped emotional and psychological from early age, and basically have zero redeeming qualities.
Do you
Uh,
think Trump could have been a good character for a novel, or is he just too much?
yeah, he's not interesting. There is no variation to his character. He is too relentlessly negative. Uh,
So like protagonist goes through changes and Trump doesn't go through changes, therefore
yeah,
he would be a bad leading man.
yeah, he's unchangeable. So he would serve, and he doesn't have moments like even Dostoevsky characters. They have negative characters like Svidrigailov. They have pangs of conscience. He doesn't. He doesn't, because he's incapable of it. He's pathological. He's a medical case. He is not the case for necessarily for a writer, not for a psychological exploration. And he's too, yeah, uniformly and relentlessly monochromatic, dark. So no, he wouldn't be quite interesting unless he could be presented in a satirical light only, like Dickens might be able to pull it off. But it's still not, because this is too serious. The guy has too much power for for a guy like him to have any. And so he's a sinister, ominous character by dint of holding the office that he does. He would be, he could be kind of a rake, a rogue character, and as he used to be before he fell into rapidly deepening dementia. Uh, uh, some 20 years ago, in the world of New York City real estate, where he was a secondary kind of player, and nobody took him quite seriously, but he was a raconteur, he was a womanizer, he was basically all in it for himself, and he was basically a contemptible character, but he was also a lovable kind of rogue, because such were the rules of the game that was played there. So he was tolerated, and moreover he was talked about because he was very good at self-promotion. But a character like this, finding himself in a situation that he is hated by very large groups of people, he cannot handle it, and he's become completely unmanageable, unreachable even to his own reason. He doesn't have any reason, and he cannot be handled by anyone. And it's absolutely terrifying to have a person like that, again, in charge of the U.S. nuclear arsenal, or in charge of lives of so many people whose lives a completely worthless character like him can ruin, and has for forever. Separating parents and children, having children die in those cages, ruining people's lives with in a variety of other ways, just infinite number of interconnected lives that get absolutely destroyed because of him, whose own life has not been contribution to anything good in humanity. And so, generally, it's very sad. But Tolstoy would include him in one of his lengthy asides in War and Peace about the role of Tsar and the ruler and dictator in history and so forth. But Tolstoy would have nothing but contempt for him. He doesn't have depth. He doesn't have dimensions. He doesn't have tragic dimension to him. He is no King Lear either. So he's a one-dimensional, just evil, vile, shallow man.
So he's too shallow for literature, but he works out well enough for real life.
Well, life is shallower than that. Well, he appeals to a certain group of people. There are 30% of people who probably would support anyone in power to begin with, but who stick
In most countries,
in most countries, including the United States.
right?
And but who, in his case, has developed tremendously strong psychological bond with him because he addresses certain areas of darkness within them. He
But could
drew
it
out.
be, there's been some recent articles I've seen which seem interesting to me because they talk about not just that there are people out there who he has given permission to kind of appeal to their darkest sides of their nature, but it's also almost, well, not almost, but a mafia approach where he had these people that supported him from the beginning support such horrendous things that he has said and supported that now to reverse themselves, they would be kind of going against themselves, and they don't want to do that, so they're kind of stuck with him like you would in a mafia where you have to kill somebody to be one of their own.
Yeah.
And there's that kind of a mindset, so and that snowball is kind of growing too.
Well, those are the people within his inner or farther circle, but generally the electorate, that there are people all across the country who have bought in to him, and it's confirmation basis. Of course, people who are capable of falling for Trump are not good at recognizing their mistakes. They're not given to introspection, but. Um, it's interesting also that how instantaneously uh, this connection was established with Trump or against Trump. If you look at the Russian immigrant circles, for instance, the larger part of immigrant community, such as it may be in the United States, Russian-speaking immigrant community, the larger chunk of it fell for Trump immediately without giving it, like, it's not like you know, you know, by way of comparison or like long ruminations. No, immediately, instantaneous connection, and to a significant but smaller segment of the same community. It was instant, rejection, instant loathing. Um, that tells one something. Uh, People responded to something. In some people accepted it immediately. Uh, he he's a strong totalitarian type of leader who brooks no nonsense, who will be very hard on minorities because suddenly the minorities have taken into their heads that they should be able to run the country. Plus Russian immigrants, of course, people who have tolerated, or Jews in particular, tolerated certain amount of humiliation or had to put up with certain amount of humiliation, if not, just uh, direct oppression, because frankly there was not that much of direct oppression, but it certainly was mild discrimination, and definitely there was humiliation to be put up with. And when one would say that how are people, how is it possible that people who have basically gone through oppression themselves uh, be sort of like taking the side of someone who is overtly racist and humiliates minorities and so forth. Well, but the unfortunate truth of the human nature is that in many instances uh, uh, experience of oppression does not ennoble you in any kind of way. It actually causes you to become cynical and apathetic. And once that pressure of humiliation and injustice, unfairness has been lifted off your shoulders in a free world, well, what people do in order to orient themselves in a new space, they look for clear-cut indicators as who is on their side, who's on the other side, and they look for people who they could start oppressing and humiliating in return, as a compensatory mechanism of sorts. And that's what happened. Trump gave them this opportunity. He said that there is no shame in that. And yes, they are better than all those other people who don't look like us and
So
don't.
let's go oppress somebody else.
Well, I mean, not physically, not mentally at this point, but generally, yes. Let's bear in mind that we're better than them, and we should treat them accordingly. So we are the real owners of this country. We are the real America, and they're not the real America. But you are, because you are what? You look white. It's interesting how that's the nature of totalitarianism. Some people fall for it immediately, and some people reject it instantaneously. Other people. So usually it's not a matter of like compare and contrast, like people walking around. So what do you think of Trump? Should I certain things turn me off, but I think that was not such process. People fell for him immediately and rejected him instantaneously. And if you talk to some fairly enlightened professional Russian immigrants, for instance, they would say, well, yeah, of course he's a horrendous human being, but I agree with his policies, but he's good for the Jews. Well, no, he's not that great for the Jews, because 77% of the Jews didn't vote for him, and even smaller percent will vote for him in 2020 if he even gets to 2020. But that's the belief, just that he is good for Israel. Well, look at how he treated Netanyahu when it became clear that Netanyahu had lost. He's not for the Jews.
Like he didn't even know him, right?
Yeah, uh, he's not good for the Jews. He's not good for anybody but himself, as he understands his own, uh, uh,
Self interests.
yeah. Yeah.
Mikhail, before we wrap up, I really would like to get your take on what is happening right now with the impeachment, not from the point of view of just the Congress and the Senate. You we've talked about that a little bit, but from the Ukrainian point of view, because again, you have not lived in Ukraine. You are from St. Petersburg, as I recall, which is Russia, an entirely different country from Ukraine. Everybody, but what is your take on what happened and the dynamic between President Trump and President Zelensky?
Well, President Zelensky is a novice. President Zelensky was not prepared at all to be Ukrainian president or to be a president of a country with tons of problems that is trying to establish itself as an independent state. He was not only was he a comedian, he was a young comedian, he was a lightweight comedian. And who basically grew up in the Russian paradigm, who speaks Russian infinitely better. His native language is Russian, not Ukrainian. He learned Ukrainian, but he speaks it with an accent. And so he was put in an almost impossible situation, in a situation where his country and he personally need tremendous amount of support from the United States, first and foremost, as basically the guarantor of freedoms around the world, or at least it used to be. Uh, you know, Suddenly he finds himself in the situation that the person in the White House essentially is in hock with the Kremlin and basically is doing Putin's bidding. So he comes into office, Trump is, full of distrust and loathing for Ukraine because Ukraine basically, did a bad thing to his guy Manafort, and generally because Putin dislikes them and Putin's enemy is Trump's enemy. And so the situation that Zelensky found himself in was absolutely intractable and absolutely, horrendously difficult. Would have been for anybody with infinitely more experience than he does, and even more inner fortitude than he does. And so and suddenly he finds himself immediately. The Ukrainian new leadership starts finding itself being blackmailed by the U.S. By the U.S. president and his henchmen, private citizens like Rudolph Giuliani, start finding themselves being blackmailed. Okay, yes, Congress has approved military aid, all these javelins, right? But you know what? I have a favor to ask of you, though. You know, and,
Yeah.
and and so that you get the message, we're going to postpone for now, right? Just to uh, somehow to make it ever clearer to you, what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is that this guy Joe Biden, whose son sat on the board of some kind of company, guest company. Uh, uh, this is what he's our main political rival, projected in 2020, as you may or may not know. We need dirt on him. Whether it's actual dirt or fabricated one, that's up to you. We don't particularly care, but we need dirt, and then we can talk about those javelins, which incidentally have already been paid for by American taxpayer.
And so the President Zelensky said, "Hey, we don't worry, everything's great. You are our teacher. We have, the general prosecutor general in Ukraine is my guy. Everything's going to be great." And then signed agreements that are now being portrayed by some as Ukraine's capitulation.
Yeah, and Ukrainians are protesting, and tough times are ahead for Ukraine. It's a horrible situation. He was put in an absolutely untenable situation, and I sympathize with him, but I don't know. Uh, I don't know what's in his head. I don't know what's in his heart. I just know that he was put in a situation that was absolutely no win kind of situation. It was a horrible, absolutely difficult place to be. He essentially squeezed. Ukraine found itself squeezed between these two superpowers. One evil superpower, that's Russia, and the other supposedly, the source of all good in the world, but headed by an evil person. You know.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Mikhail, thank you so much for your take. It's always great to talk to you. I'll remind our listeners one more time that Mikhail Iossel is author of a book, Notes from Cyberground, Trumpland, and My Old Soviet Feeling. And he's also professor at University of Concordia in Montreal, Canada. It was a pleasure to speak with you, sir.
Always a
And
pleasure, Gary. Thank you very much.
thank you very much.
You're listening to Rashkin Report.